The day my father-in-law handed me a cardboard box and told me to get out of his house, I had exactly $43 in my wallet, a duffel bag of clothes, and a 1998 Ford Ranger that burned through a quart of oil every 200 miles. My wife, my ex-wife now, I suppose, stood in the doorway of the house, where we'd lived for 3 years, and said nothing. She didn't look at me. She looked at the floorboards. Her father, a thick-necked man named Holt, who'd built a regional trucking company from 2 beat-up rigs and 40 years of stubbornness, held the door open like he was doing me a favor. "You should have kept your mouth shut," he said. I wanted to tell him that keeping my mouth shut was exactly what had gotten me into this. That 2 years of watching him run double-billing schemes through the company I'd given up my own career to help grow. 2 years of saying nothing, because my wife asked me to, because she said her father would fix it, because she said it wasn't my place, had brought us all to this exact moment. But I didn't say anything. I picked up the box, I walked to my truck, I drove away. That was a Thursday in late November, cold, the kind of cold that gets into the cab through gaps you can't find and don't have money to fix. I want to be honest with you about what the next few weeks looked like, because it's easy to tell this story like I was some kind of determined, clear-headed man with a plan. I wasn't. I slept in the Ranger for 4 nights before my buddy Theo let me crash on his couch in Binghamton. I ate gas station sandwiches and called my mother twice and hung up before she answered because I didn't know what to say. I was 29 years old and I had nothing. The only thing I owned outright, and I mean outright, no mortgage, no dispute, no legal entanglement, was a piece of property my grandfather had left me 3 years earlier. I'd almost forgotten about it. It was a farm on the eastern edge of the Catskills, 40-something acres, and a main house that my grandfather, a man named Clifford, had bought in 1967 for reasons he never fully explained to anyone. He'd used it maybe a dozen weekends a year in the 70s and 80s. Then his back gave out, the drive got harder, and the property just sat. He left it to me specifically. Not to my mother, not to my uncle, not split among the grandchildren, to me. In his will he wrote, "For Weston, who listened." My mother was hurt by that for years. My uncle barely spoke to me at the funeral. At the time I'd thought it was just the way old men made decisions, arbitrary, sentimental, and I'd felt guilty about it more than grateful. Now, driving north on Route 17 with $43 and a duffel bag, I thought about that farm for the first time in a long time. I didn't even know what condition it was in. I found out when I turned down the dirt road off County Route 2 on a gray December morning and the farmhouse came into view through the bare trees. I sat in the truck for a minute and just looked at it. The porch had half collapsed. The tin roof had rust streaks running down from every seam. 2 of the upstairs windows were dark with broken glass, and something, weather, an animal, time itself, had pushed the east wall of the old equipment shed so far out of plumb that it looked like it was mid-shrug. The pasture had grown up into a thicket of multiflora rose and goldenrod taller than my head. There was a rusted-out Massey Ferguson tractor in the weeds that I didn't remember being there. I got out of the truck. The air smelled like frozen mud and pine sap. A crow called from somewhere in the tree line. I walked up onto the porch, tested each board before I put my weight on it, and unlocked the front door with the key I'd kept on my keychain for 3 years without ever using it. The inside was dim and smelled like old wood and mouse droppings and something sweet underneath. Cedar, I thought, or maybe the ghost of cedar from some long Ago furniture. There was a cast-iron wood stove in the main room, a kitchen with an old propane range, 2 bedrooms on the ground floor, and a loft above. The well pump still worked. I had no idea why, but it did. The propane tank outside was almost empty. I stood in the middle of the main room for a long time. I didn't feel hope exactly, but I felt something shift. The thing about having nothing is that it simplifies the question. I couldn't afford to rent anything. I couldn't go back to my wife. I couldn't call my mother and explain. I could either turn this truck around and drive back to Theo's couch, or I could stay. I stayed. The first 2 weeks were about survival more than restoration. I drove into the nearest town, a small place called Millhaven, population maybe 2,000, and bought a cord of firewood from a guy selling it off the back of a flatbed. I found a heavy wool blanket at the thrift store. I patched the 2 broken windows with plastic sheeting and duct tape. I got the wood stove going and slept on a sleeping bag on the floor because the only bed upstairs had a mattress that something had nested in. Theo sent me $200 through Venmo with a message that said, "Don't be an idiot. Take it." I used it to buy groceries and a box of contractor bags and a new crowbar. Because the old one I'd found in the shed had a cracked handle, and I'd already learned that I was going to need one constantly. Here's what nobody tells you about restoring an old house by yourself with no money and no real skills. The learning curve is humiliating. I watched videos on my phone at the Millhaven Diner, where I'd nurse a cup of coffee for 2 hours and use their Wi-Fi. I read a structural repair manual I found at the county library that was published in 1987 and smelled like it had been underwater. I made mistakes constantly. I sistered floor joists wrong and had to redo them. I ordered the wrong size flashing for the roof and had to return it. I drove a nail through a water line I didn't know was there and flooded the crawl space. But here's the other thing. I kept going. Every morning I woke up before the sun because the wood stove had burned down and the cold woke me, and I'd rekindle the fire and make coffee on the propane range, and then I'd work until I lost the light. I didn't think about my wife. I didn't think about Holt or his trucking company or the 2 years I'd wasted. I thought about the next thing in front of me. The collapsed porch section, the east wall of the shed, the kitchen floor that dipped so badly toward the back corner that a marble would roll the length of it without stopping. There's a particular kind of peace in that, in having exactly one problem. By March, the porch was rebuilt. The main roof had new flashing, and I'd patched the worst sections with rolled roofing that I'd watched 3 different YouTube videos to learn how to apply correctly. The windows were real glass now, not plastic sheeting. The kitchen floor was level. I'd pulled out the old water-damaged drywall in the main room and replaced it, and I'd learned somewhere in the process that I actually didn't hate drywalling as much as most people said to. I'd also found, around the 2nd week of February, that I was starting to think of this place as mine in a way I'd never thought of anything. And then I started working on my grandfather's room. He'd had a specific bedroom, not the larger of the 2 on the ground floor, but the smaller one at the back, the one with the window that looked east toward the ridge. My mother had told me once that he'd always been particular about that room. He didn't like people going in there when he wasn't present. Even as a child, I'd understood that it was somehow his private space, the way some people have a chair that's theirs, and you just don't sit in it. The room needed work. The plaster on the south wall had blown. Something behind it had gotten wet at some point, and the whole surface had gone soft and started pulling away from the lath. I'd need to take it down to the studs and start over. I started pulling the plaster off in sections, wearing a dust mask and goggles, working carefully because old plaster falls in chunks and makes a mess. I got the south wall cleared and started on the east wall, the one beside the window. That's when I noticed something. The east wall, interior wall, running north-south, felt wrong when I knocked on it. It sounded hollow in a way that didn't match the west wall, which had the same framing but sounded solid. I tapped along the surface methodically, about 18 inches up from the floor, and there was a section maybe 3 feet wide that rang different. Not hollow like empty air exactly, but different. Dense, like there was a space behind it that wasn't connected to the wall cavity. I stood there for a while just thinking. My grandfather had built a false compartment behind this wall. That was the only explanation that made sense. The framing on the outside was normal. I could see the studs every 16 inches, but someone had built a secondary interior structure, a box essentially, set back from the face of the wall and concealed behind lath and plaster. Why would a practical, careful man like Clifford, a man who'd started working at age 14 and never wasted anything, give up a cubic foot or more of space in an already small room to hide something? I got the crowbar. I worked carefully. I didn't want to damage whatever was inside. I scored along the plaster, found the edge of the built compartment, and slowly worked the lath away from the studs until I had an opening about 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall. I reached in with my work light. There were 3 things inside: a metal lockbox, green with age, the kind with a simple key lock, a leather portfolio, the old kind with a snap closure and a monogram embossed in the corner, CHM, my grandfather's initials, and a sealed envelope with my name on it in his handwriting. Just Weston, in the careful block letters he'd always used. My hands were shaking when I picked up the envelope. I sat down on the floor of the room, with my back against the cold plaster, and opened it. My grandfather had written 4 pages by hand, which for a man who used to say that a good idea shouldn't need more than a paragraph was remarkable. He'd written it, he explained at the top of the first page, sometime in the winter of 2019, 3 years before he died, when his doctor had told him his heart was worse than they'd hoped and he needed to start thinking clearly about certain things. He had been thinking clearly, very clearly. The letter explained the portfolio first. It contained, he wrote, documentation he had accumulated over a period of about 8 years concerning his son, my uncle, Bart, and the way Bart had been managing the family's timber leases in northern Pennsylvania. My grandfather had owned about 200 acres of timber land outside of Wellsboro that he'd acquired in 2 separate purchases in the 1970s and 1980s. The income from those leases had been modest but steady, a reliable income stream that my grandfather had intended to leave to the family equally. What Bart had done, beginning sometime around 2011, was quietly renegotiate the lease terms with the timber company using a shell LLC that he'd set up, routing the increased lease payments through the LLC and keeping the difference. Over 8 years, by my grandfather's careful estimate, Bart had diverted somewhere between $380,000 and $420,000 that should have gone into the family estate. My grandfather had found out because he was an old man who paid attention. He'd noticed that the lease payments deposited into the estate account hadn't increased the way he'd expected them to when timber prices rose. He'd asked questions. He'd gotten vague answers, and then, quietly, over 2 years, he'd started pulling on the thread. He didn't confront Bart directly. He told me in the letter exactly why. Bart has 3 children, and I will not be responsible for destroying what they know as their family. But I am also not willing to let him take from you without consequence. What is in the portfolio is enough. You will know what to do with it when the time comes. The lockbox, he explained, contained 12 ounces of gold in small coins, a collection he'd built quietly over 20 years, never in amounts that required reporting, and a paper document transferring the 200 acres of timberland directly to me, contingent on his death, superseding the language in his primary will. I read the letter 3 times, sitting on that cold floor. The timberland was worth considerably more than 12 ounces of gold. Timber prices had moved significantly since the last time my grandfather had looked at comparables. When I eventually had the land appraised, it came in at just under $2 million. And that was before anyone accounted for the value of the lease income that had been diverted. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before any of that, I had to make a call I'd been putting off for 3 months. I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring. I could hear the careful way she said hello, the way you say hello when you've been waiting for a call and are afraid to show it. "Mom," I said, "I'm at Grandpa's farm. I need to tell you some things." She drove up from her home in Harrisburg the next weekend. She walked through the farmhouse slowly, touching things. The doorframe her father had made level decades ago, the windowsill in the kitchen where he'd kept a ceramic rooster that was now on a shelf in her own home. She stood in the small back bedroom for a long time without saying anything. I showed her the letter and the portfolio while we sat at the kitchen table I'd dragged in from the Millhaven thrift store. She read everything carefully, the way she always reads, taking her time, going back to sections. When she finished, she set the pages down and looked at the wall for a while. "He knew," she said. "He knew everything," I said. She was quiet for another minute. "And Bart?" "That's the question," I said. "That's what I need to talk to you about." We talked for a long time that night. My mother is a careful woman. She is not someone who makes decisions quickly or emotionally, and she'd had a complicated relationship with her brother her whole life. Not hostile exactly, but layered with old grievances and old loyalties that I didn't fully understand and never would. She had known, I think, on some level that Bart was the kind of man who cut corners. She hadn't known the specific dimensions of it. She asked me what I wanted to do. I told her I wanted to do what my grandfather had trusted me to do, not destroy, but correct. We engaged a lawyer, a woman in Scranton named Aldridge, who specialized in estate disputes and had a manner that suggested she'd heard everything and was surprised by nothing. She reviewed the portfolio documents, which were meticulous: printed lease statements, LLC registration filings, bank transfer records, comparison tables my grandfather had built himself on graph paper. She told us that the documentation was, in her judgment, thorough enough to support a civil action and potentially a referral for criminal fraud investigation. We didn't go straight to court. Aldridge suggested a letter first, a private communication to Bart, explaining what we had and what we were prepared to do with it. My uncle called me 2 days after receiving it. It was the first time we'd spoken in over a year. He started with anger. The specific bluster of a man who's been caught and doesn't know yet whether to keep pretending he hasn't been. He said the documents were misinterpreted. He said my grandfather had been confused toward the end. He said I was a kid who didn't understand how family business worked. I let him talk. I'd expected this part. When he stopped, I said, "There's also a deed transfer for the Wellsboro timberland that supersedes the will. Your name isn't on it. Mine is. Aldridge has the original." The silence that followed was the longest 3 seconds I've experienced. He came back with a different voice. Quieter. Less certain of the ground under him. In the end, we settled privately. Bart signed over a structured repayment agreement for $340,000, a negotiated figure that Aldridge advised us was more realistic than pursuing the full amount through litigation given the costs and timeline. He repaid it over 26 months. The timberland came to me in full. I received no apology and didn't ask for one. My grandfather hadn't asked for one either. He'd asked for correctness. I sold 26 acres of the timberland to fund the farmhouse restoration properly, with real contractors now, with an architect, with permits and inspections and everything done right. The main house was gutted back to the studs and rebuilt from the inside out. New insulation, new electrical, new plumbing, a kitchen my grandfather would have found excessive and I found beautiful. The porch rebuilt again, this time in white oak that would outlast me. The east bedroom, the small one with the window looking toward the ridge, I left mostly simple. Good plaster walls. A wood floor I refinished myself because I wanted at least that one thing to be mine. A single window, a single chair. I still live on the property. I kept 14 acres including the house, a woodlot, and the lower meadow that I've been working to clear back from the multiflora rows. It takes time. Most things take time. I think about my grandfather a lot out here, especially in the mornings when I'm building up the wood stove, and the windows are still dark, and the ridge is just starting to show against the sky. I think about the fact that he sat in this house, in this room, probably, and wrote 4 pages by hand for a person he wouldn't live to see again. He trusted me with something he could have burned, or buried differently, or simply let disappear. He trusted me with the complicated truth of his family, the love and the disappointment, and the stubborn insistence that things should be made right. I don't know that I deserved that, but I've tried to. My wife finalized the divorce 6 months after I moved to the farm. She sent the paperwork through a lawyer, and we had no contact. I heard later, through Theo, that Holt's company had been flagged by the dotee for some of the billing irregularities I'd known about, and said nothing. For too long, I don't feel satisfaction about that. I feel something more complicated. Something like the understanding that silence is never actually neutral. Last October, my mother drove up for a weekend and we sat on the rebuilt porch in the evening with cups of coffee and watched the light go off the ridge. She told me that when she was young, her father used to bring her here in the summer and they'd walk the property line together while he explained which trees were which and what the soil was good for, and why land was the one thing that didn't depreciate if you took care of it. She said she hadn't thought about that in years. I said I was glad she told me. The ridge was going gold, and then copper, and then the color that has no name, that last color before dark, and neither of us said anything for a long time. There was a woodpecker somewhere in the tree line, the slow, systematic knock of it carrying across the meadow. The old Massey Ferguson was still rusting in the weeds at the field edge. I'd decided to leave it. Some things deserved to be visible. My grandfather left me something he knew I'd have to work to understand. I've been working. I think that's what he meant for me to do.